This is our second class on the Maamar Ki Kaasher Hashamayim Achadoshim V'Oretz Achadosha Asher Ani Oiseh, which is the second Maamar in Torah Or and Bereishis. The first Maamar of Torah and Bereishis is the beginning of the Haftarah Ki Kaasher Hashamayim Achadoshim, and the second Maamar in Torah and Bereishis is the last pasuk of the Haftarah, one of the last pasuk of the Haftarah, Ki Kaasher Hashamayim Achadoshim V'Oretz Achadosha Asher Ani Oiseh. Now, of course, these psukim are in the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. They're not in the Haftarah of Shabbos Bereishis. The Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. Shabbos Bereishis can never be Shabbos. Shabbos Bereishis can never be Rosh Chodesh. Shabbos Bereishis is always going to be Shabbos Mevorach. Because even if Simchas Torah is on Sunday, then Shabbos is Erev Rosh Chodesh, it's Chavtes. So there's no direct connection between this Haftarah and Bereishis. And yet, the Alter Rebbe, the first two Maamar in Torah Or, as were arranged by the Tzemach Tzedek, the first Maamar is the first pasuk of the Haftarah, Hashamayim Kisi, V'ha'aretz Adem Ragla, and the second Maamar is the last, or one of the last pasuk of Torah. And I'm almost certain that the end of the Torah in Bracha also is with the same Maamar, Ki Kaasher Hashamayim Achadoshim, V'oretz Achadosha Asher Ani Oiseh. So why does Torah Or and Bereishis have these two Maamarim, which are Maamarim of Rosh Chodesh, and Shabbos Bereishis can never be Rosh Chodesh? So of course the answer is because Bereishis speaks about Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. The Torah starts off with creation, and creation in the very first pasuk is defined by Shemayim and Aretz. So the Alter Rebbe has Maamarim explaining Shemayim v'Aretz beruchnius, based on the psukim in the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh, which is the last perek of Yeshaya. So the Tzemach Tzedek decided to put these two Maamarim, Hashamayim Kisi and Ki Kaasher Hashamayim Achadoshim, at the beginning of Torah Or, not because of the connection between Shabbos Bereishis and Rosh Chodesh, but because of the connection between Parshas Beraishis and Shemayim and Aretz. What happens in the two Maamarim? What happened in the two Maamarim? He explains Shemayim and Aretz al Pichsidus. And we already learned years ago the first Maamar, Hashamayim Kisi V'Oretz Adem Ragla, that there's three concepts of Aretz: Torah Shebal Peh, Mitzvahs, Neshamas Yisrael. There's three concepts of Shemayim, and he explains Or al derech ha'avoda. Our Maamar is again talking about Shemayim and Aretz. But our Maamar talks about Shemayim and Aretz, which is going to be after Mashiach comes. In other words, the difference between the first Maamar and the second Maamar in the beginning of Torah Or is the first Maamar in Torah Or is Taka Pasuk from Yeshaya, but it's explaining what's the mysticism, what's the ruchnius, what's the spirituality of Shemayim and Aretz, which is how the Torah begins. The second Maamar in Torah Or says, now the Eibush created Shemayim and Aretz. La'asad Lavu, when Mashiach comes in El Mabad, there's going to be a new Shemayim and Aretz. So it's still connected to the concept of Shemayim and Aretz. V'haraya, it's the same word, right? Now we have a Shemayim. When Mashiach comes, there's going to be a Shemayim. It's going to be a Shemayim Achadoshim. Now we have an Aretz. When Mashiach comes, we're going to have an Aretz. It's just going to be an Aretz Achadosha. So you must understand the difference between the Shemayim and Aretz we have now and the Shemayim and Aretz we're going to have after Mashiach comes. But at the same time, you must understand how they're similar. In other words, the Shemayim and Aretz La'asad Lavi can't be so different from the Shemayim and Aretz now because we call them by the same name. So our Maamar is analyzing this idea that Shemayim and Aretz La'asad Lavi is connected to Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. And on the one hand, we want to understand how they're similar. On the other hand, we want to understand how they're different. So the last class, we learned a lot. We learned almost 150 lines. The Alter Rebbe explained Shemayim and Aretz al derech ha'avoda. That Aretz is Ratzu and Shemayim is Shev. Aretz means I'm far away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and I'm running towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Shemayim means that when I run towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu from my place of distance, Kvayachol the Eibishter runs to me. You go away from your darkness towards the light, and the light comes to meet you and embraces you. This is the Eretz and the Shemayim that we know. So the Alter Rebbe made a point, amongst many other points, that the model of Eretz and Shemayim which we have today is consistent with the Shita of Beis Hillel, that says Eretz Nivras Tchila, right? There's a Shita, one opinion says the earth was created first. The other opinion says the heaven was created first. And then in my bottom of the later Rabbeim, you also have that Shemayim and Eretz were created together. The Rebbe said that the understanding of Shemayim v'Eretz that we have today is consistent with the opinion that says the earth was created first. Why is the earth created first? Because the earth is Ratzi, running towards Hashem, and only when one runs towards Hashem does the Eibishter reciprocate and, so to speak, run back to the person. So he's almost saying explicitly that in the world in which we live, Bereishis Bodol Lakim Es Shmayim V'Sa'aretz, or Hashemayim Kisi V'Aretz Adem Ragloi, first comes Eretz and then comes Shemayim. First comes a Yid running towards Hashem, and then Hashem comes and reciprocates. When Mashiach comes, and this is going to be today's class, it's going to be the other way around. There's also going to be a Shemayim and Eretz, but it's called the Shemayim HaChadoshim and the Eretz HaChadoshim. But the order here is first Shemayim and then Eretz, not Bereishis Bodol Lakim. B'yema Seis Lakim Eretz V'Shamayim. First Eretz and then Shamayim. But La'asad Lava is going to be Hashamayim HaChadosha, Eretz HaChadosha, first Shamayim and then Eretz. Which means first Hashem is going to touch us, and then we're going to run towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is really what we're going to be discussing tonight. So if you need context, this is the context. The context is that these first Maamar and Torah Or are in the Bereishis, not because of Reish Chodesh, because Shabbos Bereishis can never be Reish Chodesh. It's there because of the idea of Shamayim and Eretz. And the difference between the first Maamar and the second Maamar, or to be more precise, the difference between the first half of the second Maamar and the second half of the second Maamar is that the first Maamar discusses Eretz and Shamayim as it is now. And when you're talking about Eretz and Shamayim, which is now, first comes Eretz, then comes Shamayim, first comes Ratzah, then comes Shuv. And Mitzvah tonight, with the help and grace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we learn the second part of this Maamar, we're going to be learning how it's going to be Shamayim Chadosha, Eretz Chadosha, Yossi Love, where Shamayim comes before Eretz. But before we go on to today's class, let's explore a little bit what we talked about in the previous class. This model that Eretz comes before Shamayim. In other words, this model that first comes Ratzai and then comes Shuv is predicated on a fact. What is the fact on which it is predicated? The fact on which it is predicated is that we're far from Hashem, that we find ourselves in darkness, we find ourselves in concealment, we find ourselves in frustration, we find ourselves in hardship, and we have to go out of it. The premise of Eretz before Shamayim, the premise of Ratzah before Shem, is because you find yourself in a difficult situation. So you have to wake up, you have to get out of the difficult situation. And after you pull yourself out of the difficult situation with a rush, with a thrust towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is there a reciprocity, is the Eibishter responding with Shamayim. When Mashiach comes, we're not going to be in darkness, it's going to be light. And therefore, instead of it being Eretz v'Shamayim, instead of it being Eretz Nivras Tchil, it's going to be Shamayim v'Eretz, Shamayim Nivru Tchil. And how did the Rebbe, how did the Maamar present this to us? The Rebbe explained this to us using the model of davening. The davening is a gradual climb. Davening is, as the Pasuk says, Sula Mutzav Arza V'Reishe Magia HaShamayma, a ladder which sits on the ground, and the top of the ladder reaches up into the heavens. And the Zohar says two very important statements. The first statement of the Zohar is, Sulam Dotz Leisa, that the ladder of Yankov Avinu in his dream, this is davening, because you're climbing from the bottom up. But the other thing that the Zohar says, which is relevant, is Shas Leisa, Shas Karava. That when one is davening, they're fighting a war. In other words, the concept of Avodas Atfilah is fighting with the Yetzer Hara. The beginning of davening, you're fighting with the Yetzer Hara on a much more basic level. And the end of davening, the fight with the Yetzer Hara becomes quieter and deeper until it is a victory. And that is the Oretz, which leads to the Shamayim. Oretz means the fight, climbing out of the darkness. And Shamayim is the light of Hashem, which rests when peace has been established, when one has successfully defeated his Yetzer Hara. So if you want to think about davening, which we talked about in the previous Maamar, in the last sheet, I talked about it a lot, and the Rebbe also talked about it a lot. I spoke a little bit about Heidah, which our Maamar doesn't have, but the Rebbe talks about Psukei Dezimra and Berachas Krishma. If you want to understand the latter, here's how you should look at it. Think of it in physical terms. Yeah, you make a fire, and you're burning wood. So if the wood is wet, it's going to make a lot of smoke. It's going to whistle, it's going to crackle, it's going to pop. It's going to be noisy and smelly. And there's always the risk of the fire going out, of course. But if the fire is strong enough to dry out the fuel, to dry out the wood, as the fuel dries, there will be less smoke, there will be less noise, there will be less popping and crackling and all of the rest, until when the wood is completely dried out, you'll have a very peaceful and quiet fire. This peaceful and quiet fire is not less hot than the noisy and dynamic fire. It's much hotter. But it's quiet. It's quiet because there's no war, there's no struggle, there's no competition, there's no combativeness. When you burn wet fuel, the water wants to extinguish the fire wants to dry out the water, and that interface creates tumult, noise, inefficiency, friction. But as the moisture dries out and the fire takes over, you have a harmonious state, a peaceful state. The journey of davening is similar to this. Yeah, the first step of davening is Meidani. It's a submission. The Meidani says, as I told you the story with the Chalamites, Ich lig in bet. You're disinterested altogether, completely disinterested. But you say with a stubbornness and with a conviction, in the expression of the Hayem Yem, that all the tumas in the world cannot contaminate the Meidani of a Jew because it comes from the deepest level of the neshama, even though my behemoth dominates me and the neshama is only biyapi, I'm laying in bed. But Torah is emes, Hashem is emes, Yiddishkeit is emes. There's a submission. That submission has a hardness to it, has a simplicity to it, but it doesn't transform the Yetzer Hara. It just, so to speak, slams him in the head. But the journey of davening starts off in Psukei Dezimra when you're very emotional. It says in Svarim, it's in Halacha, Psukei Dezimra is supposed to say out loud. It's a time of great emotion. And in Psukei Dezimra you talk about all the things Hashem gives us physically, pashat materially. And Psukei Dezimra is defined by outward emotion. And it says in Chassidus that the outward emotion of Psukei Dezimra is the fire that is drying out the moisture of the Nefesh HaBahamis and the Yetzer Hara. When you say Psukei Dezimra, you're being very passionate. And you're being passionate on the level of the Yetzer Hara. You don't come to the Yetzer Hara and say, I love God because He gave me Achmas and Hus, Achtas Hashem. You say, I love God because He gave me food and clothing and shelter. So the Psukei Dezimra stage is the emotions of a person towards Hashem on the level of the animal soul. So that's why it's so loud and demonstrative, because you're fighting fire with fire. You're using your emotions to demonstrate your love for Hashem based on what He gives you on a level where the Nefesh HaBahamis wants you to go in a different direction. When you get to Birchis Krishma, the first bracha of Shabbat is about Malachim. It says in Chassidus that the Malachim are the source of the Nefesh HaBahamis. So there's emotion there also, but it's not emotion about what we have physically, it's emotion of what's going on in the spiritual world. The second bracha of Krishma is quieter still, because now you're talking about the neshama. And Krishma itself is Mesiras Nefesh, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So the ladder of davening, which in this Maamar is called Eretz, is to get out of the darkness by first submitting and then engaging with the Nefesh HaBahamis and the Yetzer Hara, speaking his language or her language, a language of passion and fire. And then gradually the Nefesh HaBahamis quiets. He's defeated. In the first bracha of Shema, the second bracha of Shema, and then in Krishma itself, he becomes a collaborator. And of course in Shema Nesser, this is already Shemayim Kissi. This is called Shemayim Kissi. The Eibishter gives us himself. And then this total quiescence, this total peace. This is more or less what the previous class entailed. But the foundation of it all is that the Shemayim and Aretz of today assumes that we find ourselves in darkness and we want to go out of the darkness towards the light. And the order is first Aretz and then Shemayim. First darkness and then light. So let's begin the Shiur. And remember, I'm sort of cheating. What the Shiur is going to tell us is that after Mashiach comes, there's still a Shemayim and an Oretz. There's still a concept of Rotzi and Shev. But because it's not a world of darkness, it's Shemayim Nevras Tchila. First Shuv and then Rotzi, as you'll see in Mitzvah. Okay, but let's begin. It says the Rebbe on line 150, V'hinei kol zeh inyan Shemayim Oretz de'achshav. Everything we learned in the first half of the Maimed is dealing with the heaven and earth as we understand them today. In the Pasuk Bereishis Baralukim es Shmayim Vesaretz, and in the Pasuk Hashemayim Kisi Varetz Adem Raglei, and now in the Pasuk Kikasher Hashemayim Achadoshim Varetz Achadosh. And the Rebbe says, the first thing you have is Eretz running towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When one runs out of the darkness towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu reciprocates, gives him back, raises him up. And that's called Shamayim or Shuv. Aval, says the Rebbe on line 152, as opposed to Liyasid Lavei, Ksiv, the Pasuk says, there's going to be a new earth. And in our pasuk, ki kasher hashamayim hachadoshim, a new shamayim, v'ha'aretz hachadosha, and a new aretz. Says the Rebbe on line 155, upirush v'inyin ischat shezu bebechinas eretz. The reason why there needs to be a new earth, when Mashiach comes, la'yishach bechinas ratzoi the eretz al derech shehu achshav. There will not be the need or the possibility for Eretz as we have it now, which is I find myself in darkness and I'm running away from the darkness towards the light. Because the Eretz, the Ratzoi, as we have it today, is a thrust and a thirst. Lord says, to go out of the opposite of Elokus, as the Pasuk says, the world is covered with darkness and you're running out of the darkness towards the light. Canal, as the Rebbe describes it about davening in general. That the whole journey of davening is from darkness to light, from asleep to awakeness. And in Yem Sukkah de Zimra, Shu Bechinas, the concept of Sukkah de Zimra is Reim Memes Kel Begreinam, that the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is on one's lips, one's throat. But the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is on one's throat with a lot of emotion, with a lot of passion. Why? Because emotion and passion is the language of the Nefesh HaBahamis. Emotion and passion is the language of the Yetzer Hara. When you're excited about Hashem outwardly, the Nefesh HaBahamis is forced to get excited. When you're excited about Hashem quietly, as deep in the Nefesh sleeps and waits for you to finish, and then he comes back. But when you show demonstrative emotion, external emotion, which is what Psukkah de Zimra is, it touches the Nefesh HaBahamis as well. It creates the double-edged sword to create vengeance in the goyim, which is the nefesh habahamis and the guf. And of course, there's so many discussions in Chassidus about why it's a double-edged sword. Because you have to kill the klipos, which are called ribei tzimtzumim, from the bottom of the pile. And you have to kill the klipos, what's called makif ha'elyon kachasheicha ka'oira. But Psukkah de Zimra is a war. Like I told you in the last year, that the word zemer, in addition to meaning song, also means to preen, to cut down weeds, to get rid of what's not good. When one says Psukkah de Zimra, they're destroying an enemy. When one is thrusting, in rushing towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu with external emotion, pronounced, loud passion, it breaks one's will. The bechinas is to transform darkness into light. In other words, to overpower the animal soul's passions towards animalism and redirect them towards meaningful things. Says the Rebbe, the whole notion of Eretz, the whole notion of Ratzeh before Shuv, is predicated on the reality where there's darkness, which is only now. Because now, sheyesh klipos hamastirim, currently there are klipos which blocks. Pardon me. The darkness covers the land. It's garments which cover and block the truth, which is Elokus. It's written in the Pasuk, Al B'Shamayim Kadosh V'Gemer, the heaven is covered with darkness, black. When you live in such a world, you have to be careful. When you live in such a world, you have to run out of it. This is Eretz before Shamayim, this is Ratzeh before Shuv. V'lachein, says the Rebbe on line 164. This explains why In the world in which we live, where we all start in darkness, and we have to run out of this darkness, and we're vulnerable, and we can get caught in this darkness. We were warned in Kriyas Shema, Hishamru lachem, be careful, so that your heart should not become seduced, Visartem, and you go away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vishtachavisam, and you'll bow down to Avodah Zarah, you bow down to Klip. In Krishma, you start off talking about accepting Hashem, you continue talking about accepting His mitzvahs, and then you talk about the fear of Chas v'Sholem, Elikim Acherim. Now, the words Elikim Acherim, mean other gods. When I was a child, I went to Cheder, I learned Elikim Acherim means under the get and other gods. But I also learned that you're allowed to say Elohim Acherim. Because when you're talking about other gods, it's obviously not a shame kaddish. So you don't say Elikim Acherim, you say Elohim Acherim. So there's an Alter Chabad Kaasher, old question, that the Rebbe never said Elohim Acherim, he said Elikim Acherim. And I don't know what the answer is, because I never saw the answer explicitly, but I think I know what the answer is. And what I think is, because in Chassidus, Elikim Acherim doesn't mean other gods. Elikim Acherim means Hashem in a way of Acherayim. Elikim means the Eibishter, but with his back turned, where you take from Hashem without submission, without bittul. And that's the warning. Elikim, you're going to take from the Eibishter in a way of Acherayim. Pirush. Shekol klipa hamesteres. Every klipa which blocks and hides. I'm on line 165. Nikra Elikim Acherim is called other gods, or more meaningfully, is godliness with your back turned, where you don't have to submit and accept and have bittul. And idol worship. And when you allow yourself to have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where you take without having to say thank you, where you take without having to submit, so then you can be involved in the opposite of Elokus. You're taking from Hashem, and at the same time you're defying Him. And when you're bowing down to other gods, what does this mean? It's bechinas hamshacha. You're drawing yourself towards the other gods. That just like when you bow down in holiness, there's a kriya, there's a kneeling bebaruch, and then afterwards there's a shtachavoh. So the concept of bowing down is shemamshach gilei elokus. That when you bow down, you're bringing some godliness. Says the Rebbe, the same is true on klipa. The meaning of bowing down is drawing yourself to klipa, which you don't want to do. And the way you protect yourself from being drawn to klipa in this lifetime is through eretz, running away from the darkness. Now the Rebbe says the same thing using different form. He used the form of that you allow yourself to take from a lakus in the way of Acherayim, and therefore you allow yourself to be drawn into klipa. Now he says it in other words. The Gemara says, the Jewish people who live in Chutz La'aretz are considered idolatrous or worshipping idols in purity. This is the Gemara in the Sugya of Eretz Yisrael, the end of Masechta Ksubas. And it's a strange Gemara. Every Jew who lives in Chutz La'aretz is considered an Eved Avodah Zarah. So, of course, it's explained in Chassidus, it's explained in V'yadaita Moskva, amongst others. And what the Rebbe says in the Maimorim is the following, that the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, Bizman Hazeh, is that Eretz Yisrael is like Elam HaYetzira, and Chutz La'aretz is like Elam HaAsiyah. What's the difference between Elam HaYetzira and Elam HaAsiyah? In Elam HaYetzira, there's Teva. There's nature. It's not a world of miracles. Bria is a world of miracles. But you could see Hashgacha Pratis. In Elam HaAsiyah, there's Teva. And the Hashgacha Pratis is covered over. You don't see how this world is run by God. It doesn't make sense. So if you live in Chutz La'aretz and you believe in Hashgacha Pratis and you don't see it, you start to doubt it. This doubting the Eibish's involvement in the world is called Eved Avodah Zarah B'Tahareh. And it's different in Eretz Yisrael because Eretz Yisrael is a higher level, and the involvement of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, even as Managol, is from a higher place. At least, but Derech HaTeva, you see the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the meaning of this Gemara. When you live outside of Eretz Yisrael, you're not worshipping other gods, but you're not seeing Hashem to the extent that, in effect, the world is a separate God. The Hainu this means. Line 169 now, Kishu Chas V'Sholem, Legamri Chutz La'eretz Ha'yan, and one is altogether outside of the supernal land. In other words, in Chutz La'aretz. When one ceases to be in Eretz Yisrael, which at least means you're running towards Hashem, and you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, which means you're not running towards Hashem. One is drawn totally after the futility, after the frivolousness, after the emptiness, after the substancelessness of Elam Hazeh. Says the Rabbi, it's permitted. Kaasher. It's the good of Klipas Nega. This is very interesting that Dvaram HaMutarim is Tev Shabanega. When one indulges in worldly things and material things without a sense of it being in the service of Hashem, but it being in the service of itself, that's Avodah Zarah B'Tahara. It's Ishtachava, it's bowing down to Lakim Achedim, to Lakus, in a way of Acharayim, which means to Klipa. Line 173, V'zeh Nikra, Ishtachava, V'hamshacha, L'Bechinas Lakim Achedim Kol. This is what it means that you're bowing down and being drawn to Klipa. This is the darkness, this is the risk, this is the fear, the darkness that we face. The Hainu, when a Yid submits, when a Yid allows himself to become convinced that the Eibush is not a balabais over the world, like Kayin says, "Las din v'las dayin." When a Yid bows to that idea, it's teisvis yanika lachitzenim. The Yid is giving chayas to klip. Va'al yedei zeh, and as a consequence, va'atzeres hashamayim v'lo mata. Hashem stops giving us blessings. You don't see rain. In other words, the rain comes from the heavens, and the heaven, as we know, represents shuv, just like the earth represents ratzu. But when you stop running towards Hashem, Hashem stops running towards us. And that's the fear. And therefore, you have to be careful. One has to awaken within himself on the sense of urgency and thrust and rushing towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from darkness to light, from choshech to eir. Im yasem elav libe, when one applies his heart to run towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to transform darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness, and to serve him with one's heart. This becomes the Ratzoi from darkness towards light. From Meida'ani to Psukei de Zimra, to the first Barach of Shema, to the second Barach of Shema, to Krishma itself, to Yitzias Mitzrayim, and then to Shemini Esrei. And then, of course, if you remember yesterday's Maamar, after Shemini Esrei comes Torah, and after Torah comes Mitzvahs. These are all different levels of Shuv, of what Hashem gives us. And the Rebbe concludes on line 180, when we don't get seduced, when we don't get distracted, and we recognize the darkness for what it is, and we dedicate ourselves to running away from the darkness, when we come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem shines light upon us. This is called Shammai, and this is called Shei. And this is life as we know it. This is the world in which we live. This is Elam Hazeh. So in the language of this Maamar, Eretz Kadma L'Shamayim. First comes earth. First you have to run to Hashem, and then Hashem reciprocates. Now we're going to do 182. Turn the page. Ma shein ken liyasid lavi, as opposed to what happens when Mashiach comes. Because when Mashiach comes, there's no darkness. So obviously there's no risk, there's no fear. Yishamru lachem. But not only is there no risk and there's no fear, there's no need to run. The pasuk says, Hashem removes the spirit of uncleanness from the world. There won't be a phenomenon of klipa. Hamasteres Gilia Lakus, which hides revelation of godliness. You know, it says in Sfarim that before Chet Eitzadas, klipa shemeres lepeiri. Before the original sin, a peel, a shell, only protected a fruit. After Chet Eitzadas, klipa mechasa ala pri, it blocks, it hides the fruit. So now a fruit, the shell, it may protect the fruit, but it also blocks the fruit. Also, love it'll be like it was before the original sin. Mechasa ala pri, it's making ala pri, protects the fruit and it's not covering it over. So there won't be klipa to hide. Which is why it says, the Mashiach comes, Hashem is not going to have any levushim. Hashem is not going to be garmented and concealed whatsoever. And therefore, and we're going to be able to see the Eibishter. Says there, but think about it. If you live in a world of light, what do you have to run away from? And what do you have to run towards? So what's the edits? And specifically, what's the edits first? Im kain, accordingly, ein tzarech klal. At that point, it's completely unnecessary to have inyan bechinas habitl shalayesh, the bitl of one's yesh, shizehu haratzu, because the achshav now you must have it. Lot says bechinas hepech hamenaged b'chol, the opposite and the opponent, etc. But when Mashiach comes, there's none of that. There's gili alakuz. So you don't need aretz. You certainly don't need aretz, which is running from darkness to light, and you certainly don't need aretz, which is kedim l'shamayim. So the Rebbe says on line 186, "V'zehu," and this is the pshat, hineni eisach hadosh ha'aretz. When Mashiach comes, there's going to be a new earth. Pirush. In other words, shelo yikmei achshav, the earth is not going to be as it currently is. Because how is it currently? The earth is bechinas ratzu, it's running towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'sarus ad latata, an arousal from below, which one has to journey, to push himself out of the klipa. Shayidei zayiyam shacha, then he bring godliness down, which would be the shamayim that comes after the eretz. But when Mashiach comes, since sha'oz, then kivan sheyiyah gila lamata kamela maila, there's going to be a revelation of the world. Moreover, it's going to be a revelation of Sevav Kalalman, which is B'chol Mokim B'Shavet, to be equal everywhere. The lowest world and the highest world are going to have the same godliness naturally. Says the Rebbe, Im Kain Ein Shayach Ratu. There's no possibility to be in darkness. There's no need to run from darkness into light. So Mashiach comes, the earth becomes a whole other Metzias. Well, Kain Amar. So the Torah teaches us, Sheyihi Ya'az, when Mashiach comes, there's going to be Bechinas HaShamayim HaChadoshim. A new heaven and a new earth, because there's not going to be darkness, there's not going to be running away from darkness, it's not going to be running towards darkness, there's going to be light. And that's why the Pasuk says the words, I'm reading again, Hashamayim HaChadoshim, the new heaven, the new earth, Asher Ani Oiseh, that Hashem says, I will personally create. So the Rebbe translates the word Ani. Ani Davka, Atzmos Amhos, Hashem himself, who is called I, is responsible for the new heaven and the new earth. The Hainu, what is the connotation? Mitzad isarusa d'liyela bilvad. When Mashiach comes, it's going to be godliness, which is unilateral from heaven to earth. The Eibishter is unilaterally going to give us elakus in a way of isarusa d'liyela, which is called ani. V'lei mitzad isarusa d'latata klal. After Mashiach comes, there's going to be no concept of an arousal from below. Now, when you say there's going to be no concept of arousal from below when Mashiach comes, there's two parts. Number one, B'chlal, there's not going to be an arousal from below. And number two, there's not going to be an arousal from below as a beginning, as a eres nevras tchila, because one is going out of darkness. Line 192, Ke'ein tzadich esrus ad latat. In the world of Mashiach, there's no longer a need for this arousal from below. Rak levared ulahapich mechashech al neda kanal, because the need for esrus ad latat is only in a world where there's darkness that needs to be clarified and transformed into light. Aval asid lave, when Mashiach comes and Elam Haba occurs, shein tzadich that there's not going to be a darkness that needs to be made into light. There's not going to be a bitterness that needs to be made into sweetness. There's going to be only an arousal from above. So the Torah says, now there's an eretz and a shamayim. And the beginning of the Haftarah says, Hashamayim kisiv, Oretz Hadei Meragla. The Shamayim is Hashem's tool to descend to us. And Oretz Hadei Meragla, the earth is our tool to raise ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, as the Rebbe taught us in the last Maamar, that first comes Eretz, and then comes Shamayim, first comes Ratzu, then comes Shu. So in this second Maamar, the Rebbe says, that's how it is now, before Mashiach comes, before the Izgalus. After Mashiach comes, the Elam Haba, first comes heaven and then comes earth, because there's no darkness, there's no need to run away from it. Al Kain, therefore, Omar, I'm line 195, the Pasuk says, Asher Aniyis. At the Eibush themselves, I'm going to create a new heaven and a new earth. Why? Because it's a heaven and an earth that doesn't deal with darkness. And the heaven and the earth that does not deal with darkness is the personal creation, the personal influence of the Eibush himself. And he calls them B'Shem Shamayim Chadashim, Be'eret Chadash, a new heaven and a new earth. And he's making it Pirush. This means Sheboyim, that they come Bebechinas Gila, in a revealed way, unilaterally, from one direction, from heaven to earth, mitzad atzmus hamaitzel, because of the Eibishter, or the emanator, the source of everything, as he is Atzmus. Atzmus means as he is in relationship with himself. The truth of Hashem is going to be revealed from heaven to earth in a form that's called Shamayim Chadashim. That is Chadashim, there's no darkness. It says this kind of an idea, that there's a world where godliness is revealed. And in this world where godliness is revealed, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. This never happened before. Okay, bebechinas gilui, in a revealed way, bereishis ha'ishtalshlos, in the beginning of creation. Because in the beginning of creation, there was taka concealment. Kmei, for example, the pasuk says, in Bereishis, in Genesis, it describes how Hashem creates the earth and then the heaven, but it says that the earth and then the heaven are created through the divine name Havaya, along with the divine name Elokim. Inyan Elokim zeh hainu. The use of the word Elokim in this pasuk, just like in the very first pasuk of the whole Torah, Bereishis bara Elokim, means bechinas hatzimtzum v'ahest, contraction, blockage. In other words, Yeshamayim v'oretz the Yachshav, the current phenomenon of heaven and earth, physically and spiritually, nimshach the Shem Elokim, are a product of the divine koyach of concealment. This says in the pasuk Bereishis bara Elokim v'geim, in the beginning Elokim created. Elokim is lashon dinim and gevura, heaven and the earth. And therefore, since you find yourself in darkness, you remedy this, you correct this by eretz, which is a thrust, a rushing forward from your place of darkness towards the light of Hashem. Nimtak hadin v'atzimtum the Shem Elokim. It sweetens the judgment and the concealment of the name Elokim, hamayla mumastir, and it becomes a little bit lichtik, a little bit illuminated, but in the order of Eretz v'Shamayim, darkness to light, Rotzei and then Shem. Says the Rabbi, that's why in that same pasuk, besides for saying Shem Elokim, it also says Shem Havaya. V'zel b'yema says Havaya Elokim. In other words, you have Elokim, you have concealment, but you have the remedy for the Elokim, which is the Havaya, which is the reward for the Ratzu. Shenichel Elokim zeh Havaya. The darkness is included in light. And that's why it says, Pirish Asay Savaya Elokim, which is Yichud V'Skalus Shemes El Yachad, that in the world in which we live, naturally godliness is concealed, but He gave us a koyach to run out of the darkness, which is called Ratzu, or Eretz, and then we'll have the light, which is called Shamayim, or Shuv, or Havaya. Says the Rebbe V'Kol Zahu, and the requirement for this is either Eretz V'Shamayim, first earth and then heaven, B'chinas Ratzu V'Shev, and he repeats again, I'm on line 204, the first thing is Eretz. And only afterwards is there Shuv. Right. So we just learned 2 whole pages. We learned a bunch. Yeah. We learned over 50 lines. Yeah. Learned 50 lines, more than 50 lines. Yeah. And these 50 lines really reinforced everything we learned in the previous year. That the world as we know it is darkness, and our relationship with the Eibishter begins with us running out of it. And then comes light, which is called heaven. So now the Rebbe continues, line 206. Avol, however, la'asid. What happens when Mashiach comes? What happens in El Mabah? Says the Rebbe, Shiyu Shamayim Chadashim Eretz Chadash. There's a new heaven, there's a new earth. Says the Rebbe, Hu B'chinas Asher Ani Yossi. This comes directly from Hashem. And directly from Hashem means V'lo Ya'idei Tzimtzumim D'Shem Elokim. It's not at all connected to the divine name Elokim. In other words, it's not at all connected to any kind of concept of concealment. For us, and in a world where Hashem Himself sees to it that both the heaven and even the earth are filled with light, Yihiyu Shamayim Kedim. First comes heaven and then comes earth. Says the Rebbe, Ki Ein Tzarech, because it's unnecessary. Lebechinas Kedimes Haratzu V'cholu. It's unnecessary to have Ratzu before Shave. Why? You're in the light. When you're in the darkness, you have to first run out of the darkness. That's Ratzu. Or in the light, it's the other way around. First you have Shamayim, first you have Shuv, and then you have Ratzu. And what the pasuk says, V'yo Yotzak Barak Chitze, which is Gilim or Mailo Lamata. First Hashem gives us, and then we respond. So we have an interpretation of psukim. It's very gishmak, interpretation of psukim. All in Pnimiyas Sanyanim, right? We're not explaining the physicality or the literal understanding of these psukim. We're explaining them in ruchniistic terms, in metaphysical terms. And the point, in short, is that in darkness first comes Eretz, which is Ratzu, then comes Shamayim, which is Shuv, and in light it's the other way around. Nu frega Kaasher. Something should bother you. What should bother you? What should bother you is that lost at love, you shouldn't have an Eretz. If Eretz means running towards Hashem in a world of light, you have to run towards Hashem. Hashem is with you. Line 211. We understand the difference between Elam Haza and Elam Haba. In Elam Haza, you're in darkness and going towards light. So Eretz, Nivras, Tchila, and Shamayim, Nivru, Achakach. First, you run out of the darkness, and Hashem embraces you. When Mashiach comes, it's going to be a world of light, so it's going to be Shamayim, Nivru, Tchila. First, Hashem is going to give us, and then we're going to respond. But the Rebbe says, I don't understand. Why la'asad lavi is there going to be a new heaven and a new earth? Pardon me. If it's true, as our Maamar just taught us, that the Shemayim and Eretz Lavi are unilateral, give some heaven to earth, which is the actual meaning of the words. Ani Oise says the Rabbi Kaasher. Im Kain, the question is, how is there an earth altogether? Because the earth still means Bechinas Ratze, which is Miloshen Rotz Kanal, to run and to have a thrust, like we discussed yesterday. And the Kasha is not why is Shamayim before Eretz. The Kasha is there should be only Shamayim, there shouldn't be an Eretz at all. The Lama Omar, why is there a message altogether of a Ha'aretz HaChadosha Asher Ani Eisa, a new earth, which the Eibishter himself does, says the Rebbe, Lo Yehoya Leila Haskid, Rak Bechinas Shamayim Lavad. They should have mentioned only heaven, because heaven means divine revelation, divine offering, divine giving. Why do you have to have the infinite Eretz? It's a good kasha, yeah? If Eretz v'Shamayim is predicated going from darkness to light, and in the order of first Eretz, then Shamayim, in a world full of light, you don't need Eretz order. So we're going to learn the Teretz now, right? Beginning on line 219. But before we read it, I'm going to briefly introduce it. Okay, I'm going to start off the Shir with a brief preface. It says in Chassidus that there is a difference between Atzmus and Giluyim. In the simplest of words, the difference between the Eibishter and the Eibishter's light. What's the difference between the Eibish and the Eibishter's light? The difference between the Eibish and the Eibishter's light is the Eibishter's light is an Atzmi. And the Eibishter, pardon me, is an Atzmi. Hashem exists by himself, in himself, with himself. The light of Hashem is a hispashtus. The light of Hashem comes from him. And one of the many different ways to explain the difference between Atzmos and Giluyim, the difference between God and godliness, Hashem himself and Hashemliness, is the difference between motion, tnuah, and stillness. When something exists from itself alone, by itself, it's completely motionless, it's completely still. Why? There's no reason to be in motion. There's no reason to go anyplace. As opposed to when something exists from outside of itself, there must be motion. There has to be tnuah. Histalkus ve'hispashtus, ratze ve'shev. Inside here, we're going to have another expression soon, mate v'lei mate. What is the motion? One motion is your connection to your source, and the other motion is your manifestation into the world. In other words, when we talk about the revelations of godliness, as long as we're not talking about atzmos, there has to be two tnuas. Hashem himself has no tnuah. In other words, when in this world there will be a revelation of atzmos mus of Hashem himself, there won't be a concept of Shamayim and Eretz. There won't be a concept of Ratzi V'Shev. There won't be a concept of Mati V'Lei Mati. But so long, where even if godliness is revealed, but the godliness that's revealed is called Oyer, is called Gilu, is the light, as opposed to the essence, there must be two tnuas, must be two motions, the motions of connecting to the source and the motions of coming to the world. And that's what we're about to explore. The world in which we live has a Ratzi and a Shev. We're separate from Hashem. How separate from Hashem are we that we can even possibly make a mistake? So we run away from the mistake towards Hashem, and Hashem reciprocates. La'asad lave, there's going to be light. There's not going to be the fear and the risk of going astray. But there's still going to be a separation between heaven and earth, between the Eibishter and the world, pardon me. And in as much of the separation between the Eibishter and his world, their relationship is based on two tnuas, Ratzei v'Sheiv, or Mati v'Lei Mati. This is why even when Mashiach comes, there's a concept of Oretz. So first there's Shamayim. Shamayim means Hashem gives us something. And Oretz means we go back to him to be renewed. Now Oretz means I'm running away from darkness. Then Oretz is going to mean you gave me light. I'm going to reconnect the light to the source for it to be renewed, to be replenished. So as long as you're dealing with Giluyim, you have to have two Tnuas. In darkness, the Tnua and the order of the Tnua is Ratzei v'Sheiv. In light, the Tnua and the order of the Tnua is called Mati v'Lei Mati, or Shuv and then Ratzei. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information, just a little bit. There is a very comprehensive sugya in Chassidus called Ratzei v'Sheiv. It's a long, involved sugya. If I'm not wrong, I believe there's a Maamar of Pesach, Tafresh Ayin Zayin, Ezras, I think, which discusses this whole thing. But in the Hemshech Tafresh Ayin Beis, in the Maamarim after Shavuos Tafresh Ayin Hei, Shavuos Tafresh Ayin Hei begins with the idea of Yom and Laila, Eir Cheshach. And then he goes from there into Ratzei v'Sheiv. There must be 4 or 5 Maamarim that explain a bunch of levels of Ratzei v'Sheiv. They explain Ratzei v'Sheiv in Klipa. They explain Ratzei v'Sheiv in Kedusha, what the way it is in Zman, or Seder Zmanim, and Ishtalshalos. And then they explain Ratzei v'Sheiv, Madregas of higher than Zman, higher than Ishtalshalos, because Ratzei v'Sheiv exists till the first Tzimtzum. I saw in a Maamar, in Samach Vav, that before the Tzimtzum there's no Tenua, and after the Tzimtzum there's Histalkos v'Hispashtos. So there's a very, very involved discussion on Ratzei v'Sheiv in Chassidus, and they explain many levels. There's a Ratzei v'Sheiv which can't be concurrent. It has to be successive. First Ratzei, then Sheiv. First Ratzei, then Sheiv. That's called Zman. Then there's a Ratzei v'Sheiv which could be concurrent at the same time. Ratzei v'Sheiv together. This is called Seder Zman. And even higher than that is what we're calling here Mati v'Lei Mati. So there's a lot of levels. And if you have an interest, look up my Maamar. They're very geschmack, they're very involved. So before we go to the text, let me translate the 2 words Mati v'Lei Mati. Mati v'Lei Mati, at the very end of this Maamar, on line 250, the Rebbe is going to bring from Kabbalah, from the Arizal, from the Eitz Chaim, that Mati v'Lei Mati is a concept in Kabbalah. But the words Mati v'Lei Mati are not the same thing as Ratzei and Sheiv. The words Mati v'Lei Mati are really more like Sheiv and Ratzei. Because Mati means to reach us. Mati means to come to us. And Lei Mati means not to reach us, not to come to us. So Mati means how Elokus comes down. Lei Mati means Elokus goes up. So it's the opposite order than the Ratzei v'Sheiv. In Ratzei v'Sheiv, first you go up and then you come down. In Mati v'Lei Mati, first you come down and then you go up. Why? Because the Ratzei v'Sheiv model is predicated on the idea or the point of view or the fact that you're separate from Hashem. If you're separate from Hashem, first there's Ratzei and then there's Sheiv. What if you're connected to Hashem? But you're connected to Hashem not in a way of Etzem. You're connected to Hashem in a way of Gilui. That connection follows the same basic design, but with the opposite order. It's the same basic design. You have to have 2 motions, 2 tnuas. And the opposite order, first Matay, Elokus emerges from Atzam Samus to reach us. V'lei Matay, and it renews itself, it goes back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the Pshat. Hashamayim HaChadashim v'Oretz HaChadash. When Mashiach comes, there's going to be a new heaven and there's going to be a new earth. So the first point is, Shamayim Nivru Tchil. In Olam Haba, Beishamay is going to be right. First the heaven is created, then the earth is created. First Hashem gives us, and then we reciprocate. And the second idea is that our reciprocation is not running from darkness to light. It's running from what the Eibishter gave us back to the giver. From the light that radiated from him to us, back into him. And the Seder is Mate. First the Elokus reaches us, and then V'lei Mate goes back to Elokus. So there's Taka heaven, and there's Taka on earth, because as long as you're dealing with Giluyim, there's got to be 2 Tnuas, like I said before. But the order is first Mate, first the equivalent of Shuv. Godliness emerges from the source to reach the world, and then V'lei Mate, it renews itself with Elokus. And this is the answer to the question. The question was, l'cha'eda lasad lavi, there should be no eretz, there should be only shamayim. Why does it say eretz? And the answer is because even lasad lavi, we're dealing with giluyim. And as long as dealing with giluyim, there has to be two tnuas. But the two tnuas are in the backwards order because you're dealing in the world of Gilui Lakus. First Shuv and then Ratz. So the Rebbe begins on line 219, and we're going to read it inside. Acha'inyin who the teretz is. The gam bebechinas is erusa d'liela bilvad. Even if you maintain, says the Rebbe, the premise that I established, that when Mashiach comes, the light is going to be on, godliness is going to be revealed. And as a consequence, whatever we have in our relationship with Hashem is going to be coming unilaterally from Him. He's going to give it to us for free. Says the Rebbe, nevertheless, yesh beis madreges halolu de ratze v'shev. There is something which is close to, similar to, the concept of ratze v'shev we had earlier, except that now ratze v'shev is eretz and then shamayim. First ratze and then shev. And li'asad lave rak shamayim kod maladas. First comes heaven, then comes earth. First comes shuv and then comes ratze. So now you have a ratze v'shev. You start in darkness and you go towards life. Let's love you. You have a shev ratze. You start with atzmos and then there's gilui. Well, lahavin, says the Rebbe on line 221. Let's explain. How can you describe godliness running and urgently escaping from the world to include itself in the Eibishter, as is called atzmos hamaitzel me'achar shein davar master l'fanav klal. If godliness is not at all concealed, the whole world is a revelation of godliness. So what's the rush? What's the thrust? What's the running? It says the Rebbe on line 223. The Teretz says Hine Yuvan Derech Mashal. The explanation can be understood based on an analogy, and the Rebbe brings you several examples for the idea of duality. He gives you an example from respiration, and he gives you an example from your heart rate, or from your pulse, that you breathe in and then you breathe out. Yeah, and the pulse is constantly beating, clap, 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 and the heart. And the Rebbe is going to argue that all of these systems, breathing and the pulse or the heartbeat, work in a Seder, first Ratzeh, then Shev. I'm sorry. Works in the order of first Shev and then Ratzeh. First, the life comes from the Eibishter to the person, and then it goes back to the Eibishter. First, the pulse brings chayas to the person's bloodstream, and then it goes back to the Eibishter. In other words, it's Ratzeh v'Shev backwards. So the Rebbe says inside line 223, Hine, you've another Rachmashal explanation requires a preface. We see Ratzeh v'Shev in the biology of a person, the physical person's guf. In what way? So there's several parts. Okay, you'll see soon he's going to talk about breathing and he's going to talk about the pulse. The spirit of life which is inside of a person. Which pounds in his heart, which beats in his heart. The Zer talks about, argues that the heart has a pulse, the heart has a beat, and the beat has two tnuas of Shuv and Ratzeh. Says the Rebbe, the vitality, the vibrancy of the heart, Bob and Neshima, comes through breath. Yeah, the blood goes into the heart, and it goes to the lungs, and it gets oxygenated, and it goes to the whole body. And the Rebbe argues the first thing that happens is the oxygen comes into the person, then it goes out. That's Shuv and then Ratzeh. The life of one's heart comes through breath, which is the concept of Ratzeh v'Shev, but not first I run to Hashem and then Hashem gives me life, but His Pashas v'Estalkus. First Hashem gives me life. The air breathes into my lungs, and then I give it back to Him. This repeats itself again and again. It expands from Hashem into the person. And again it departs. And again it expands. It's no different than the pulse in one's hand. The life is drawn down. And it's expanded. And then it again departs. And then again So both in respiration and in pulse, both in heartbeat, the Rebbe says he understands, he knows this as a matter of fact, that the first tnuah is shuv, life coming into the lungs, life coming into the bloodstream, and then it goes back to the Eibishter. But just like it's true of respiration, it's true also of the cardiovascular system, of the blood. of the heart. First, the blood brings godliness to us, and then we give ourselves to the Yebishter. There's an expansion, then there's a subsequent expansion of the spirit of life in the heart. It's exactly the same thing as Ratzei V'Shev. And of course, at this point, the Rebbe is not going into the differences, which comes first, Ratzei and then Shuvah, then Ratzei. He's simply observing the phenomenon of Tenuah, motion. A living thing, which is not God, which is everything but the Eibishter himself, is perpetually in motion. And on the lower level, the Seder is Ratzei V'Shev, and the higher level is Shuvah and then Ratzei. V'nimtza, line 230, kum t'chaysid hazeh, Ratzei V'Shev kazeh. This kind of movement of connecting to Hashem and then bringing Hashem to the world, hu hakel beguf ha'adam atzmei, adayin, it's about each individual person in relationship with himself, without having to mention another. And even when you're dealing with a person by himself, it's still true that there has to be two motions, two tnuas. And as you see soon, the Seder is first Shuvah, then Ratzei. Line 233, V'gam, another thing which becomes understood from this mashal, another thing can be understood. If the first thing this mashal teaches us is the concept of tnuah, of motion, the second thing the mashal teaches us is that the Seder of the tnuah is first matei, which is shuv, and then lei matei, which is ratzei. Shabedfik or the liba in the pulse of one's heart and in the respiratory system, ein haratzei kedem l'shuv. The running to Hashem is not before Hashem settling. Now, Bereishis, and all the rest, the earth comes first because you have to first run from the darkness to the light. But L'asad Lavid will also be the equivalent of a Ratzei V'Shev, but the Seder is going to be first Shuv and then Ratzei. But to the contrary, Hashuv Kedem L'Ratzei. First, godliness emerges from the Eibishter and enlightens us or enlivens us, and then it goes back. And the Rebbe again used the word. We see it clearly. How the Rebbe sees it clearly, the Rebbe has good eyes. But the Rebbe says, I want you to know that the respiration and the oxygenation of blood happens first. Chayis comes into the person, and then it leaves the person. The first is life emerging from the neshama to the conscious person's heart. That's settling. Godliness coming from heaven to earth. Bringing in the light which is above the person into the vessel. However, immediately it re-departs, which is bechinas that it has to go out of the vessel to renew itself from its source, and then again, this happens over and over and over again. This idea that in the pulse or in the heart, there's two motions, bang, 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 and that the Seder is first Shuv and then Ratzei is also true when it comes to respiration in one's breath and one's mouth. First, the life emerges from the Eibishter to the world, and Yad Yachsa Bechazara is going to then go away, V'Yachsa V'Yispasha is going to come back again, and so on and so forth. But the Seder is Shuv and then Ratzei. Says the Rebbe, Ukedug Mahazes. Just like we described, the idea of two tnuas, both in respiration and the cardiovascular system, and that the order is first hispashtus and then histalkus, first shuv and then ratzu. Yuvan lemaila bechinas ratzei v'shev. We can understand the phenomenon of ratzei v'shev, but shemel maila lamata, backwards. First shuv and then ratzu, which is called mati and then leimat. And of course, I'm skipping the small type. The shayach gamke bechinas ratzei, because even after Mashiach comes, there's going to be ratzei. You know why? Because as long as we're dealing with Giluyim, as long as we're separate from Hashem and having a relationship with Him, there has to be two tnuas. The tnuah of the life reaching us from Him, and the tnuah of the life going back to the Eivish to be renewed. Rak, the big difference is, so I guess you have these two ideas. Point number one, that as long as you're dealing with Giluyim, there has to be tnuah, motion. And point number two is that the tnuah has to be a ratzei and a shev. It is only that in a world where Hashem is revealed, Shamayim nivru tchila, it's ha'ispashtus ha'ed, kedem love. First the light goes out of the source to reach us, shuv, mati. Then it goes back into the source, which is the equivalent of lei mati or ratzei. And then of course the cheder and mishpash. So the Rebbe is partially explaining a pasuk. Yeah, that's what he's doing, explaining a pasuk. And the explanation is very gishmak. You should know that the Shemaim and Oretz. But now the Shemaim and Oretz is the Seder Ratze V'Shev. Lost at love will also be a Shemaim and Oretz, but it's going to be a Shemaim Echadash and Eretz Echadash. It's all going to be based on Ani, and the Seder is going to be Shemayim first. Says the Rebbe on line 248, V'Zeh this is the Pshat in the pasuk Kel Deidi Deifeg. The voice of my friend is banging. Shakel v'amshoch azmamayla lamata. We're dealing with the voice, with the friend. The friend is the Eibishter, which is coming from heaven to earth. And the pasuk uses the expression deifik, which means pulse. What's the remes of this choice of word deifik? It's gamkak my beginners of deifik and so the aforementioned pulse. And what is it about a pulse? 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 2 movements. And then the Rebbe says 250 v'nikra zeh be'etz chayim b'shem mati v'lemati. This form of motion, which in the lower levels is first ratzi and then shave, and therefore it's called ratzi v'shev. On the higher levels, it's first shave and then ratzi. It's called mati v'lemati. Mati means it reaches us, and lemati it means it doesn't reach us anymore. And he explains, sha'er mati, the light emerges and reaches us. It's revealed to us. Then umispashet, and it expands to fill us with light and life and energy. V'chezer umistalak, then it goes away. V'leimati, in which case it's not reaching us. Shebechinas mati, the meaning of the Aramaic word mati, which means unsuririn, to reach, is bechinas hispashtos, is the expansion of life or light from the Eibusha to the world. Says the Rebbe, when you're talking about a world of divine revelation, it's keidin lebechinas leimati. It happens before the leimati, which means the departure, the coming moment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because hakel bechinas elokus atzma, we're dealing with godliness itself. So now, because of the darkness, it's eretz and then shamayim, ratzi and then shuv. Lost of love, because of the light, it's going to be shamayim and then eretz mati v'leimati. Says the Rebbe line 243. The Eibusha is compared to fire, and he explains in yindimin shefa lekus leish. The comparison between godliness and fire is for the same reason. The nature of fire is to go away. But the Rebbe says fire also has 2 motions. It goes up and it comes down. And look at the next 5 words. He makes a statement. You should know fire first descends and then it ascends. Fire is not running away. First it comes down, then it goes up. Now how the Rebbe knows this? But he says you should know the physical facts are that the relationship between the neshama and the guf, first it comes out, then it goes back in. And the relationship between godliness and the world, in a revealed state, first it comes down into the world, and then it goes back into lakus. Acher, it's after Hayispashtus, it expands to fill the world with fire, kedimian, the fiko, the liba, the aforementioned example from a pulse and from respiration and so on. So basically, we say that Asad Lavid is still a Ratzi and a Shave, but the Seder is Mati v'le Mati. Line 257, Zawi and Hashmayim Achadashi, Varetz Achadashi. You should know when Mashiach comes, there's going to be a heaven, like there's a heaven now. You should know when Mashiach comes, there's going to be an earth, like there's an earth now. And heaven means to come down, and earth means to go up. This new heaven and this new earth in that order is first of all godliness being drawn down from heaven to earth, which is a unilateral gift from heaven to earth. But you should know that there's also 2 motions, because as long as dealing with Giluyim and Tnuah, there's 2 motions, and the 2 motions are Shamayim, which is Shuv, and Eretz, which is Ratzui, in that order. Shamayim, Kodmu La'aretz. Line 259. Hamshacha is Bechinas Mati. First of all, godliness is drawn to us, and it reaches us, which is called Shamayim, Hashem gives us. And afterwards, Bechinas Haistalkos, the light goes away from the Kli to renew itself in the Eibishter, which is called Lai Mata, or Eretz, and Ratzui. So the Rebbe says in line 261, V'lachein, therefore, Kan, when Mashiach comes, the halacha is going to be like Beis Shammai. That Shamayim nivru tchila. Now the halacha is like Beis Hillel. Eretz nevras tchila, Ratzui and then Shuv. Lost of love is going to be like Beis Shammai, Shuv, and then Ratzui, which is Mati v'lei Mati. Kadam Shamayim l'Eretz. Heaven comes first, and then comes the earth. B'yeis bechinas mati, because the godliness going out of the Eibishter to reach and touch us comes before the bechinas leimati. The idea that you have to run back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. 262, Mashain came be Ratzav Yeshuv den Ephraim, as opposed to Ratzav Yeshuv as we know it. Ratzav Yeshuv as we know it today, it's Tzarech li'eschila eretz bechinas Ratzav. First you have to have the earth which is running to HaKadosh Baruch Hu from darkness. V'chakach shamayim bechinas Yeshuv, and then the Eibishter reciprocates to that thrust forward, which is what says in the Pasuk, V'chayis Ratzav v'shev, first Ratzav and then shev. And it also says, V'yem says Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim kanal. Because in life as we know it, when we find ourselves in darkness, first you run away from the darkness towards Hashem, and then Hashem settles. And when Mashiach comes, there's not going to be a darkness of Ashkeret. Hashem first gives, and then he pulls back. Zehu inyan. This is the pshat. Kaasher hashamayim v'achadoshim, chamayim achadoshim v'aretz achadoshim. There's a new heaven, a new earth, which the Eibush is going to make himself. And then it says the words, Eimdim lefanai. Lifanei dafki, in front of Hashem. And of course, in Chassidus, the word panim, the word face, means the pnimis v'atzmos of Erein Seif. The bechinas pnimis v'atzmos, ma'she'eni esrus l'tata magat Hashem. The face of God is atzmos. So Hashemayim achadoshim, v'aretz achadoshim is lefanei, is in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. You know, that you look in Kabbalah's for him, from the Rishonim, the Ramban, and Chumash, and others. The word face, panim, is connected to Malchus. Panai goes on Malchus. Shechina they call it, which is the lowest level. Because in the earlier Mekubalim, they think of a face as a mask. The face of a person hides what's going on behind it, which is the brain. So they see the word panim as being a very low madreg. In Chassidus Chabad, they make panim into the highest thing. Like it says in the Pasuk, Chochmas Adam Toyer Panav. On the face of a person, you could see the whole person. The ganze Mensch is nikera from Panav. The whole person you could see on the face. So the Rebbe here says, Eimdim lefanai means the face of Hashem, not the way it's concealing, but the face of Hashem, which is revealing the essence. And the face of Hashem, which is revealing the essence, is the source of Shamayim, Nivru Tchila, Mati, and then Aretz, which is the Leimot. So we're holding line 268. We have a few more lines left. I sort of want to catch my breath as if I want to. We're going into a new union, okay? And I must tell you that we're learning the Likutei Torah. How many times did the Rebbe say this Maamar? A dozen, at least. The Maamar of Reish Chodesh and the Maamar of Mocher Chodesh, the Rebbe gives noch Chanan. Both the Maamar Hashemayim Kisi and the Maamar Ki Hashemayim Chadoshim. And the Rebbe said them all the time. And if you learn them, I learn them and I teach them, Baruch Hashem, and they're on my website at InsideChassidus.org. So you're familiar with the ideas, yeah? How does the pasuk go? Ki Kaasher hashamayim achadoshim v'aretz achadoshim. When there will be a new heaven and a new earth, Asher ani oisa, that I will make myself, Eimdim lefanei, that are going to stand in my presence, in my face. Kain Yamei Zarachem v'Shimchem, so will stand. Zarachem means your seed, and Shimchem means your name. That's the pasuk. Ki Kaasher hashamayim achadoshim v'aretz achadoshim. The oisa, just like there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, there's going to be an Amidah, there's going to be a preserving of Zarachem v'Shimchem, the seed of the Jewish people and the name of the Jewish people. Now what's the obvious chiddush in these words? When you read this pasuk, what strikes you? What strikes you is there's going to be a time, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. But there won't be new Jews, huh? Zarachem v'Shimchem. That's one of the pshatim on this pasuk. La'asad Lavi is going to be a Shamayim Achadashim, a new heaven. Eretz Achadash, a new earth. You're not going to say Zera Chodesh and Shem Chodesh. Zarachem v'Shimchem, the same Zera, the same seed, the same children you have now. And the same Shem, the same name you have now is going to be La'asad Lavi. So the pasuk is saying that even when the whole universe is so transformed, and there's a new Shamayim, a new Aretz, it's the same Jews, which is a remarkable testament to the specialness of the Jewish people in the world. But here, the Rebbe is going to explain it differently. Because what I just told you was how some of the Rebbe explained, that Shamayim is Chodesh, Eretz is Chodesh, and Zarachem v'Shimchem is forever. How does he explain it here? So let's begin to read inside line 268. When Mashiach comes, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, which is going to stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shamayim HaChadosh, Na'oretz HaChadosh, Asher Ani Eisa. Then the pasuk continues, there will also be a preserving of the seed. That means the children of the Jewish people, and Shimchem, the name of the Jewish people. So he translates each one separately. Peter Zaracham v'Shimchem Hu, the seed of the Jewish people, the name of the Jewish people. This is the Serus Latata. It's what we give Hashem, what we call Ratzah from the bottom up. In this class, we talked about how when Mashiach comes, everything is unilaterally from heaven. Heaven comes first. Shamayim nivru tchila. But the words Aracham v'Shimchem, even L'asad Lave means us. Key. So the Aracham, the Rebbe is going to say, means mitzvahs. And Shimchem, the Rebbe is going to say, means Kabbalah Sel. Key. Mitzvahs are called seeds. Like it says in the Pasuk, Zeret Stocker. Just like when you plant a seed, things grow. When you do a mitzvah, you're planting a seed which is going to grow tomorrow. And Idei Zematzmiach Yeshua, it sprouts forth Yeshua, which is the idea of Shinai and Ahed, a very high level of godliness. So Zera means the mitzvahs which you plant on this earth. And Shimchem, says the Rebbe on line 272, Hu Bechinas Kabbalah Sel Macha Shamayim, like it says in the Pasuk, Vayaz David Shem. So there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and the same mitzvahs and the same Kabbalah Sel. It's already been explained extensively. The new heaven and the new earth is gilui, is a revelation from such a high level that our inspiration doesn't touch there at all. Comes, but it comes unilaterally from heaven. So Hashem gives us automatically. So the pasuk says, "Sal kadai techamina." You would maybe make a mistake and say, the bringing of godliness through our initiative, which is the concept of Torah and mitzvahs, which is also the concept of Eretz v'Shamayim Shalanu, our earth first, and then our heaven. In other words, so you would maybe think Tia B'Teila Lagamri will be totally nullified, totally bittled. Because it's a very intense revelation, which is from the Madreg of Asher Ani Eisa. So the Rebbe says, this is why the pasuk says there's going to be a whole new world, and there'll still be a Jew in his Judaism. Omar, the pasuk differ has to bavorin and tell us, it's a whole new world, a whole new revelation, but a Yid is still doing mitzvahs and having Kabbalah Seil. Even this level of Esrusat Latata. Yes, Allah will be uplifted. Lias aimed him funny to stand in front of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Madrega Pnimius Mamish, like Shamayim Chadashim and Eretz Chadashim. But the most important thing to bear in mind is there's still going to be mitzvahs. There's still going to be Kabbalah Seil. But it's going to be on a much higher level. As the pasuk says, Hina Yaskal Avdi, that the servant who goes on Mashiach is going to become wise. Yoram v'nisav gavam eida hainu Avdi bechinis isrusat latata. Avdi, which goes on Mashiach, he interprets as a slave, Esrusat Latata, loved of Shamra, Bechinazu Mamish, this level Mamish, this Allah, Be'ili Achar Ila, I think of him 8 from a very high level. So also loved is also going to be mitzvah, it's also going to be Kabbalah Sel, but at a much higher level. That's it, the Maamar is over. Amazing. It's a pretty long Maamar to learn in 2 classes for us. And the reason we learned it so quickly is because the Inyanim are very familiar. The Alter Rebbe is very, very maidich. And it is the right thing. To this Maamar, to be learned in 2 classes is the correct thing to do. The Nekuda is that until there's a Gilui Ha'atzmos, there has to be a Tnuah. Now that Tnuah is Ratzi and Shave, Lasad Love, Tnuah is going to be Mati V'le Mati. And although I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 90% sure, that Mitzvah Hashem, the next time we convene and learn, I'm going to learn the Beer. Because even though the Beer discusses the same things, the Maamar discusses it, but discusses it in a very, very different way. So, v'niske, v'nichye, v'nire.